The glimmering facade. The scent of gardenias and freshly cut grass was the signature perfume of Emerald Lakes. It was a perfectly calibrated fragrance, much like the life of Eleanor Vance. At 40, Eleanor was a masterpiece of effortless grace. Her hair, the color of rich caramel, was always swept into an elegant loose chignon. Her afternoon uniform, a cream-colored linen dress and understated Tiffany pearl earrings, spoke volumes without saying a word. She was the matriarch of the neighborhood's social calendar, the queen of the perfect minimalist palette. Her world was a meticulously curated Instagram feed brought to life. Today's event was the annual Summer Gala Planning Committee meeting, hosted, naturally, in Eleanor's sun-drenched conservatory. The three other committee members, all dressed in acceptable pastels, sipped iced tea and murmured praise for the arrangements. "Honestly, Eleanor, no one does tablescapes like you," sighed Margaret, dabbing a bead of condensation from her antique coaster. Eleanor offered a serene smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "It's simply about attention to detail, darling. Nothing is more tiresome than carelessness." Carelessness. That was a word Eleanor had banished from her vocabulary years ago, the moment she married Richard Vance. Richard, 42, was the embodiment of the American dream. Handsome, driven, a financial titan who had built his empire on bold bets and a flawless reputation. He was the anchor to her polished society life. Together, they were the ultimate power couple of Emerald Lakes. That evening, as Eleanor prepared for their private dinner, the perfection cracked. She was in the laundry room, checking the pockets of Richard's tailored navy suit before sending it to the dry cleaners. Not because she distrusted him. Eleanor trusted in facts, not feelings, but because she was systematic. She found the usual, a platinum credit card, a room key to the Grand Hyatt downtown, a plausible place for a business lunch, and a crumpled receipt from a specialty wine boutique on the outskirts of town. It was the receipt that snagged her attention. $8,450, 12 bottles of a rare, high-end Bordeaux. Amount of the wine purchase, in fact, was channeled through a blind trust established in her name, Eleanor Vance. She wasn't just finding his secrets. She was finding her own incrimination. The final blow came when she noticed the date of the most recent, large-scale transfer. It was the same night of Margaret's annual charity ball, a night Richard had claimed to be delayed in Dallas due to an urgent merger. Eleanor looked at the file name one last time, her fingers tracing the screen. Vance_exit strategy, first_draft, PDF. Eleanor closed the briefcase with a soft click. Her heart was not pounding. It was cold and steady. The iced tea she'd served this afternoon was sweeter than the realization blooming in her mind. Her perfect life was a beautiful, meticulously painted lie. And her beloved husband was not just cheating their clients. He was setting her up to take the fall. Richard emerged from the bathroom, his face smooth and smiling. "Something wrong, dear?" he asked, kissing her cool cheek. Eleanor smiled back, her eyes finally reaching that chilling, determined place. "Not at all, Richard. I was just marveling at how absolutely perfect everything is." The game, Eleanor realized, was about to begin, and she would not be losing. The double shock. The next 48 hours were a master class in emotional suppression. Eleanor moved through her days like a finely tuned machine, ordering groceries, coordinating her daughter's tutoring schedule, and hosting a small luncheon. But behind the serene smile, her mind was a supercomputer, processing data from the wreckage of her marriage. She spent the first morning securing digital evidence, using a burner laptop she'd purchased years ago, a quiet insurance policy she'd never anticipated needing. She duplicated the Vance_exit strategy federal_draft bot PDF and secured every financial trace Richard had carelessly left in her name. The spreadsheet was conclusive. Richard was preparing to declare bankruptcy, leveraging the blind trust in a way that would legally shield his assets, while simultaneously rhythm against her ribs. The door opened. "You really need to remember your room key, darling," Richard's voice purred. "I know, I'm hopeless," a female voice giggled. "Just grab my work bag, please. I need to get back before Ted notices I'm wearing his damn tie." The air froze in Eleanor's lungs. It wasn't just the familiarity of the voice. It was the casual intimacy, the shared laughter, the sheer audacity of the woman standing a mere 10 feet away. It was Veronica Hayes. Veronica, her neighbor, her best friend. The woman who sat in Eleanor's conservatory every Tuesday, sipping iced tea and commiserating about neighborhood gossip. Veronica, whose children played with Eleanor's, whose tears Eleanor had dried during a recent marital spat with her own husband, Ted. Veronica turned, her arm looped around Richard's waist, her hair slightly mussed, and her eyes sparkling with illicit pleasure. Eleanor didn't breathe. She didn't move. She allowed the sheer, brutal force of the betrayal, the financial ruin intertwined with the deepest emotional wound, to wash over her. It was a moment of absolute, devastating clarity. Richard left the room to grab the luggage cart. Veronica turned back towards the mirror, smoothing her dress. Eleanor saw her chance. With the silence and precision of a predator, she slipped out from behind the curtain, her heels making no sound on the thick carpet. She retreated down the hallway, the Grand Hyatt key now burning a hole in her palm. She didn't feel sadness. She didn't feel heartbreak. Those emotions were too messy, too weak for the catastrophe she had just witnessed. Instead, a sensation akin to metallic chill spread through her veins. It was the birth of cold, perfect hatred. By the time Eleanor reached her car, she had analyzed the situation with the ruthless logic of a battlefield general. Richard and Veronica had not only stolen her future, but they had also publicly humiliated her under the guise of friendship and marriage. She would not cry. She would not scream. She would not give them the mahogany desk and began to draw. This wasn't a financial projection or a party seating chart. This was the map of their destruction. Eleanor wasn't an assassin, but she was a former investment banker with an IQ that had always intimidated her male colleagues. Her weapon would be precision, process, and paperwork. She wrote 2 names at the top of the page, framed in a stark red box: Richard Vance and Veronica Hayes. Below them she charted her objectives, writing in a sharp, clean hand: financial decapitation. Richard must lose everything, not just his wealth, but his reputation and his freedom. He needed to be criminally liable, leaving Eleanor perfectly clean. Social annihilation. Veronica must be exiled from Emerald Lakes, losing her social standing, her friends, and the safety net of her current marriage. The perfect exit. Eleanor must emerge with her assets, her dignity, and full custody of their daughter, completely untarnished by the scandal. She named the entire strategy the Artemis plan. Artemis, the Greek goddess, was beautiful but unforgiving. She was the hunter who sought justice, often ruthlessly. Eleanor liked the sound of it. It felt cold, clean, and utterly separate from the woman who had cried over a broken vase last year. The betrayal had not broken her heart. It had sharpened her mind. Her first step was reconnaissance. She created new encrypted communication channels, changing her passwords to lines of code only she would understand. She reviewed the financial documents again, identifying the weakest links in Richard's fraud, the offshore accounts that could be traced back to his personal devices. The most difficult part was playing the part. She had to be the perfect wife for just a little while longer, close enough to monitor their movements. She had to smile at Richard across the dinner table, discuss school plans with Veronica in the market, and pretend the world hadn't shifted on its axis. The next morning, she descended the grand staircase, already dressed for the day. Richard was at the breakfast nook, reading the Wall Street Journal. "Good morning, my love," he said, folding the paper. "Office, ready to initiate the first phase of the gathering the leverage. The game required players, and Eleanor knew Richard and Veronica had underestimated her resources. While Richard had dismissed her as a mere society wife, he had forgotten that Eleanor had been a financial analyst before she was Mrs. Vance. She understood networks, data retrieval, and most importantly, leverage. Richard's sudden trip to Miami, undoubtedly a weekend rendezvous with Veronica disguised as an urgent compliance audit, gave Eleanor the perfect operational window. Her first target was the most obscure, yet most crucial asset, Benjamin "Benny" Klein. Benny was a quiet, brilliant IT specialist who had been Richard's right-hand man for 5 years until Richard, in a moment of arrogant cost-cutting, had publicly fired him just 6 months ago. Benny had not gone quietly. Eleanor remembered the look in his eyes, the same metallic chill she now felt in her own. Finding Benny wasn't hard. His digital footprint was meticulously maintained. Eleanor contacted him via a secured encrypted email, using a cryptic subject line that only Benny, who was privy to the early stages of Richard's illicit dealings, would understand. Regarding the Bordeaux transaction, Eleanor agreed to meet that evening at a sterile, brightly lit all-night diner far from Emerald Lakes, a place where no one would ever suspect Eleanor Vance of ordering coffee and pie at 10 p.m. When Eleanor arrived, Benny was hunched over a laptop, looking exactly as she remembered, intense, slightly unkempt, and radiating quiet resentment. "Mrs. Vance," Benny said, his voice flat. "I expected a divorce lawyer, not a socialite." Eleanor slid into the booth opposite him, her elegance jarring against the vinyl seats and the smell of old grease. "Mr. Klein," she corrected gently, "tonight, I'm simply a victim seeking justice, and perhaps a partner with shared interests." She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She slid a printout across the table, a specific, deeply buried transaction from the Vance exit strategy file, showing Benny's name was once used as collateral, a cheap betrayal Richard had used to secure a temporary loan. Benny's eyes widened, recognizing the exact method of his humiliation. "He used me," he with clean copy of the initial evidence I secured before Richard locked it down. More importantly, it contains Richard's complete unredacted contact list, including every one of his discreet clients, the ones he'd pay a fortune to keep silent. She paused, letting the implication settle. "You help me put Richard behind bars, and you walk away with enough information to restart your career, to be a silent, well-paid savior to a whole host of compromised executives, plus a substantial compensation, of course." Then he closed his laptop, a slow, malicious smile spreading across his face. "So, the perfect wife wants to play dirty." "I want justice, Mr. Klein," Eleanor corrected, her voice firm. "Justice and retribution. And I prefer my revenge cold, clean, and irreversible. Benny took the drive. The Artemis plan. Let's see how Richard handles a digital ghost who knows all his secrets. The alliance, forged in shared betrayal and financial data, was sealed. Eleanor Vance had her first piece of leverage. The hunt was officially on. The Vance residence was dressed for war, though only Eleanor knew the enemy was already inside. She had titled the evening "A Casual Summer Mixer," but every flower arrangement and chilled bottle of Chardonnay was a deliberate part of her facade. Richard and Veronica arrived fashionably late, entering the living room arm in arm with their respective, unsuspecting spouses. Richard was overtly charming, immediately cornering potential business partners. Veronica, clinging to her husband Ted's arm, threw Eleanor a casual, conspiratorial wink, the type of gesture shared between old friends. Eleanor met the wink with a radiant, utterly sincere smile. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar. "Veronica, darling, you look exquisite," Eleanor purred, leaning in for an air kiss. "That Chanel dress. Richard told me he saw something similar on his last trip to Miami and thought of you." The word Miami was delivered without emphasis, yet "You really should try this, Richard. I finally got around to tasting the bottle you purchased last week," she said, her voice dripping with affection. "It's surprisingly good, considering you told me you despise this vintage." Richard's hand shook as he took the glass. The wine was the exact vintage from the $8,450 receipt she had found. The receipt linked to his initial fraud setup. His eyes flickered, searching her face for confirmation that she knew everything. "It's an acquired taste, Eleanor," he mumbled, taking a sip that tasted like ash to him. "Well, I'm learning to acquire it," she replied, her gaze fixed on him. "It's important to understand everything we own, wouldn't you agree?" Meanwhile, in a quieter corner of the room, Benny Klein, operating remotely, subtly infiltrated Veronica's smart home system, a key part of her digital life that managed everything from security cameras to climate control. Eleanor had instructed him only to plant a small, easily triggered glitch. Just as Veronica was regaling a small crowd with a story, every light in the Vance home flickered, then snapped off for a sharp, terrifying second. When they came back on, Veronica's phone, which was sitting on the coffee table, began to play an extremely loud, highly recognizable piece of music. Richard's favorite obscure Italian aria, a song he used to play in his study late at night. Veronica froze, her face draining of color. She snatched the phone, fumbling to silence it. Her casual friends exchanged confused glances. Eleanor, standing nearby, rushed over with practiced concern. "Oh, Veronica, how embarrassing! That's Richard's song, isn't it? Technology is such a nightmare when it goes wrong." Veronica managed a strangled, "Yes, a total nightmare." She looked at Eleanor, then across the room at Richard, who was now staring at her with undisguised suspicion. The seeds of mutual distrust and fear had been successfully planted. The evening ended not with warmth, but with a palpable layer of icy suspicion between Richard and Veronica. Provided her with the crucial detail, a weakness in Richard's proprietary trading algorithm, a loophole he used to mask his largest illegal transfers. Eleanor didn't need to expose the whole scheme yet. She just needed a demonstration of power. She sat at her home computer, staring at the complex web of Richard's offshore funds, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wasn't just viewing the data. She was preparing to interact with it. A financial surgeon ready to make a precise, crippling cut. "Benny, are you certain the back door is stable?" she typed into the encrypted chat. A rapid reply. "As long as you only take a sample, do not attempt a full transfer. This is a warning shot, Eleanor, not the kill." Eleanor smiled faintly. She selected a small, seemingly insignificant fund, a holding company in the Cayman Islands that Richard used to process his monthly expenses. She used the back door to initiate a microtransaction error, a glitch that shifted a mere $500,000 from one of Richard's completely legitimate public accounts into a flagged, frozen account overseas. It was a small sum for Richard Vance, but the error was precisely the kind of anomaly that triggered automated compliance flags at his level. Within an hour, Richard's cell phone began to ring incessantly. He was in his home study, attempting to calm Veronica down. Eleanor could hear the fury and mounting panic in his raised voice. She walked in, holding 2 steaming mugs of Earl Grey tea. "Darling, you seem stressed," she said, her voice soft and caring. Richard glared at his phone, his face pale. "It's nothing. A slight stupid error in the Cayman accounts. Compliance is being idiotic." Eleanor handed him the tea. "Oh, the Cayman accounts? I've been meaning to ask you about those." She sat down opposite him, her expression shifting from wifely concern to something much colder. "I received a strange letter from your firm's private legal counsel this morning, asking me to sign off on a new trust amendment. It mentioned a rather large liability shift, Richard." She didn't wait for him to respond. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a dangerous whisper. "I know about the untraceable settlement, and most importantly, full custody with zero contention." Richard was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead. The chilling realization hit him. Eleanor knew. And she wasn't hysterical. She was lethal. "If you don't agree to those terms by the end of the week," Eleanor continued, setting the tea mug down with a deliberate clink, "the $500,000 anomaly will become a $50 million indictment. I will personally ensure the SEC gets a complete, anonymous, and legally damning package on every one of your shell companies." She stood up, leaving him sitting in a state of controlled terror. "Think of this, Richard," she said from the doorway, her voice now a cutting whisper. "You have 2 choices. A clean, quiet financial escape, or complete public destruction. I'm the one holding the match, and I promise you, I will watch you burn." The power dynamic had violently and irreversibly shifted. Eleanor had fired her warning shot, and Richard Vance was finally paralyzed with fear, realizing he wasn't married to a trophy wife, but a predator in a cream linen dress. Befriending the enemy. Richard was subdued, his arrogance replaced by a simmering, terrified compliance. He had agreed to Eleanor's financial terms, buying himself a week of silence while his legal team frantically assessed the damage. This was Eleanor's cue to pivot to Veronica Hayes. Eleanor knew she couldn't simply attack Veronica. That would look petty and emotional. The Artemis plan required Veronica's destruction to look like a natural, tragic consequence of her own poor choices, amplified by the perfect pressure applied by Eleanor. The next afternoon, Eleanor drove her sleek black Mercedes to Veronica's house. She carried a basket filled with gourmet pastries and a bottle of expensive champagne. Veronica answered the door, her eyes wide and wary. She was clearly shaken by the previous night's phone incident and the visible stress emanating from Richard. "Eleanor, what are you doing here?" Veronica advice. Eleanor smoothly changed the subject to Veronica's husband, Ted. Ted Hayes was a successful plastic surgeon, meticulous and deeply concerned with his family's pristine image. "I was looking at the plans for the gala, and I noticed Ted's name isn't on the sponsorship list this year. Is everything all right with his practice? I heard a whisper about a malpractice claim last year, but I'm sure that's just local gossip, isn't it?" Eleanor's eyes were wide and innocent. Veronica's false composure shattered. Her hand gripping the champagne flute began to tremble. This was her weak point. Ted's deeply buried secret. That was settled quietly, Veronica stammered. It was a ridiculous, frivolous suit. "Ted is the best in the city." "Of course he is," Eleanor reassured her, but she didn't let up. "I only ask because the committee is quite particular. You know how they are about image, especially with Ted's mother joining the committee this year." Veronica paled further. Ted's mother, an influential socialite, was famously judgmental and had no knowledge of the malpractice suit. Eleanor had successfully identified the specific, fragile thread holding Veronica's life together. Her fear of exposure to her in-laws and the resulting social ruin. Richard's financial trouble was remote. Ted's secret was immediate. "Look, I need to get ready for a meeting," Veronica said abruptly, standing up. "Thanks for the champagne, Elle. I needed this." "Any time, darling," Eleanor said, giving her a gentle, knowing hug. As their cheeks brushed, Eleanor whispered softly into Veronica's ear, a final, chilling probe. "Just be careful who you trust with your secrets, Fee. In this town, even walls have ears." Eleanor left, the gourmet pastries untouched. She knew Veronica wouldn't sleep that night, torn between the terror of Richard's impending disaster and the immediate threat to Ted's practice. Eleanor had been careless with her trust. Now Veronica would be careless with her secrets. The pressure was building, and Eleanor had her finger on the precise spot where Veronica would crack. Eleanor gave Richard a certain power couple, initials RV and EV, whisper of deep financial fissures beneath the surface of their gilded life. While the wife maintains an impeccable facade, the husband, a financial titan, seems to have forgotten the golden rule. Don't dip into the wrong accounts. And on an unrelated note, is it just me, or has a certain well-known plastic surgeon's wife, VH, been looking particularly pale and jumpy lately? Could it be the stress of helping a friend with an urgent offshore situation, or perhaps the fear that old, costly secrets from her husband's practice might resurface? Just asking questions. Let's hope all our dear friends keep their affairs, both financial and otherwise, in order. Eleanor clicked publish and walked away from the burner laptop. The brilliance of the post lay in its plausible deniability. It offered no hard facts, but perfectly connected the existing, vague fears of the community, Richard's rumored instability, and the known perfectionism of Ted Hayes with a single sinister narrative. Within hours, the local social media groups were buzzing. The whisper post was passed around in private texts, dissected over morning coffee, and analyzed at the country club pool. The reactions were immediate and precisely calibrated. Richard. He was furious, instantly suspecting his legal enemies. He called his PR team and ordered them to find the source of the leak, sinking time and money into a futile investigation. Crucially, the post confirmed his worst fear. Someone knew about the finances. His panic escalated, leading him to make rash, visible mistakes at the firm. Veronica, She was devastated. The mention of costly secrets sent her into a tailspin. She became convinced that Eleanor was planning to leak the details of Ted's malpractice suit to her judgmental mother-in-law. Her fear of social ruin trumped her loyalty to Richard. She began withdrawing, growing cold and suspicious of Richard's phone calls, fearing he was somehow drawing her deeper into his web of ruin. The pressure on the Hayes marriage also began to mount. Ted, oblivious to Veronica's affair, but hyper-aware of his image, demanded to know why his wife's name was being linked to gossip about offshore scams. Later that evening, Richard came home demanding Eleanor talk to him, his control completely gone. Village of Emerald Lakes to turn the community's passive curiosity into an active weapon against her husband and her betrayer. They were already bleeding socially, and Eleanor hadn't even lifted a finger in public. The Black Swan event. Richard Vance was cornered. His panic wasn't about the money he might lose. It was about the loss of control. He was spending all his energy trying to silence the Gold Coast whisper and battling Veronica's rising paranoia, forgetting that the real threat lay in the digital shadows. Eleanor, calm and utterly focused, knew it was time for the decisive, catastrophic blow. "Benny, now," she typed into the encrypted chat. The moment had arrived for the Black Swan, a financial term for an unforeseen, high-impact event that disrupts all known assumptions. Richard believed he had protected his core illegal assets by moving them through a sophisticated shell company network, codenamed Project Chimera. He had only guarded against a simple audit. He hadn't guarded against his own wife. Benny initiated a sequence of commands targeting the central ledger of Project Chimera. This wasn't a $500,000 error. This was an engineered, systemic failure. Benny didn't steal the money. He forced the ledger to temporarily show a $75 million shortfall across 3 key investor accounts, coupled with an automatic, anonymous whistleblower flag triggered within the central banking system. The effect was immediate and seismic. Richard was in his office downtown when the first panicked calls came in. It wasn't the SEC. It was his biggest, most volatile investors. They saw the missing funds, the anonymous flag about systemic fraud, and immediately demanded an emergency liquidation. His carefully constructed web of financial deception didn't just unravel. It imploded. Richard rushed home, abandoning his office, his face slick with terror. He found Eleanor in the conservatory, calmly reading a novel, the picture of domestic tranquility. "Eleanor, what did you do? What the hell did you do?" he roared, the sound echoing through the perfect, silent house. He was shaking violently, his designer suit suddenly looking like a ragged costume. "I imagine the authorities will be looking very closely at your recent behavior." She stood up, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Richard actually recoiled, seeing not his wife, but an executioner. "You tried to ensure that when your house of cards fell, I would be the one buried under the rubble. The poor, ignorant wife responsible for the fraud," she stated, each word a hammer blow. "You gave me the weapon, Richard. You taught me where the weak points were." He stared at her, the truth finally breaking through his arrogance. You actually planned this. You aren't just trying to hurt me. You're trying to destroy me." Eleanor gave him a single, icy look of triumph. "Revenge, Richard, is merely the art of correcting injustice. You stole my life, my trust, and my future. And now, I'm taking back the pieces. Consider this your final warning, before the authorities do the talking for me." The Black Swan had landed, leaving only wreckage, and Richard's rapidly accelerating panic in its wake. He had lost his composure. his money, and, critically, his belief that he was still in control. The unveiling. The morning after the financial implosion, the atmosphere in the Vance home was toxic. Richard was holed up in his study, frantically trying to mitigate the damage and salvage what little remained of his empire. He was sweating, yelling at lawyers, and drinking straight whiskey before noon. Eleanor, meanwhile, was preparing for the final, necessary conversation. She dressed simply, a tailored gray suit, sharp and uncompromising. She found Richard hunched over his desk, surrounded by binders. His hair was a mess, his face unshaven. The financial titan was gone, replaced by a terrified, middle-aged man. "You've ruined me," he choked out, looking up at her with pure hatred. "You'll be ruined too. We'll both go down for this. You're named on the trust." Eleanor didn't flinch. She walked to the desk, her movements slow and deliberate, and placed a thick, sealed manila envelope in front of him. "Sit down, Richard," the appointed trustee. "That is premeditation." A transcript of a phone call. "This is a recording of you and Veronica 2 months ago, where you explicitly discussed the logistics of blaming the shortfall on my incompetent oversight of the blind trust. That is conspiracy." A letter from her newly retained, very aggressive divorce attorney. It wasn't just a letter, it was a formal, non-negotiable, stipulated judgment of divorce. Richard's eyes raced over the documents, his face a mask of escalating horror. The recording was the killer. He had always believed his study was soundproof. "Benny," Eleanor stated simply, answering the unspoken question. "He's a genius, and unlike you, I pay him properly." You betrayed me. You set me up," Richard stammered, grabbing the divorce decree. "No, Richard. You betrayed me first," Eleanor said, meeting his eyes without blinking. "The affair with Veronica was cheap and predictable. The plan to destroy my life and leave me financially destitute to save your own skin? That was unforgivable." She pointed to the divorce decree. "The terms are simple. You sign this today. I get the Hamptons house, my full legitimate share of the marital assets, and full undisputed custody of our daughter. In return, I delay providing this entire evidence package, including the recording, to the federal authorities for precisely 48 hours. 48 hours, he croaked. "Why?" "Because it's the only time you have left to use your money and your influence to secure the best possible legal defense before you are formally indicted," Eleanor explained, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. "It's the only courtesy I will ever extend to you. You choose the manner of your professional death, but the death is non-negotiable." Richard looked from the indictment evidence to the divorce papers. His empire was already crumbling. His reputation was in tatters. Fighting Eleanor would guarantee an immediate spectacular ruin and a long prison sentence. With a shaking hand, he snatched a pen. He scratched his signature onto the divorce decree, the formal, final end of the Vance perfect life, dictated entirely by the woman he had tried to destroy. Eleanor watched him sign, a ghost of a victorious smile. Devastating public indictment. The news broke on every major financial channel. The financial titan of Emerald Lakes was revealed to be a master fraudster, accused of orchestrating a $75 million scheme. The image was everything in Emerald Lakes. Now, Richard Vance's image was permanently tainted. A mugshot replaced his society portrait. Meanwhile, Eleanor watched the slow, agonizing social demise of Veronica Hayes. Eleanor didn't have to lift another finger. Veronica, driven to paranoia by the Gold Coast Whisper Post and Eleanor's subtle threats, had made a series of panicked, careless errors. Believing Ted was about to leave her over the gossip, not the affair, she initiated a frantic transfer of assets from their joint accounts to a private one. Ted Hayes, meticulous and controlled, immediately spotted the massive withdrawal. He confronted her, Not about Richard, but about the money. Their confrontation was loud, volatile, and, tragically for Veronica, overheard by her newly arrived, highly critical mother-in-law. The subsequent divorce was a spectacular, very public disgrace. Ted not only filed for divorce, but, in his fury over the asset transfer, publicly alluded to his wife's reckless and highly inappropriate associations with known financial criminals, a devastating euphemism that every resident of Emerald Lakes understood. 1 week later, Eleanor found herself at the annual charity luncheon, the event she was ostensibly still planning. She arrived late, dressed in a simple, stunning black dress, radiating an aura of quiet, powerful composure. The atmosphere was palpably different. The whispers were no longer about her. They were about Veronica, who was suddenly absent from every social list, and Richard, who was posting bail. Margaret, the committee head, rushed to Eleanor. "Eleanor, my darling, you are a vision of strength. We are all just aghast at Richard's betrayal. Thank goodness you're so sharp. We all knew he was working too hard, but fraud?" Eleanor accepted their pity and admiration with grace, but her heart was cold. She was not a victim seeking comfort. She was the architect of this ruin. As she sipped her sparkling water, Eleanor saw Veronica's sister, Anne, rush out of the luncheon room, tears streaming down her face. Eleanor excused herself and followed, sought justice. And the world, driven by the very greed and gossip that defined Emerald Lakes, had delivered it perfectly. Richard was facing prison. Veronica was a social pariah, ruined by her husband's own hand. The perfect wife had succeeded. She had corrected the injustice, and the feeling was not triumphant elation, but a deep, chilling satisfaction. Her shell was unbroken, her honor intact, and her path to a clean, liberated future was clear. The new curtain. The movers were quiet, efficient ghosts. They worked around the edges of the Hamptons beach house, packing the few items Eleanor had chosen to take, mainly her books, her art, and the antique silver tea set her grandmother had left her. She left the rest of the vast, luxurious home to Richard's creditors, a final, cold farewell to the Vance name. The divorce was final, sealed and uncontested. Richard Vance was awaiting trial, his reputation pulverized, his assets seized. Veronica Hayes was gone from Emerald Lakes entirely, having sold her house at a desperate discount and vanished into the anonymity she had once scorned. The retribution was absolute. Eleanor stood in the empty living room, the space stripped of the perfect furniture she had so painstakingly chosen. For the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, inhaling the salty air of the ocean outside the French doors. She didn't feel triumphant joy. That was too fleeting. What she felt was the deep, solid satisfaction of justice served with surgical precision. She had been broken, betrayed, and discarded, but she had refused to become a victim. She had corrected the balance, not with tears or screams, but with intellect and unwavering control. Her daughter, now safely enrolled in a new private school with Eleanor's new financial footing secured, was thriving. That was the only true victory that mattered. As she stepped out onto the wide porch, Benny Klein, her loyal and well-compensated accomplice, pulled up in a nondescript car. He held a small, pristine blue envelope. "Your last task, Benny," Eleanor said, handing him a final, hefty second glance. She fed the blue envelope into the machine. The sound of the paper being torn to shreds was loud, brutal, and profoundly satisfying. The perfect wife was officially retired. She turned back to Benny, her eyes clear. "Where to, Eleanor?" he asked. She didn't name a city or a town. She named a direction. South. She was leaving the Hamptons, the East Coast society, and the memory of Richard and Veronica behind. She had liquidated the perfect image, and now she would invest in the authentic woman. Eleanor slid into the back seat of the car. She put on a pair of oversized, glamorous sunglasses, a new purchase, a small symbol of the woman who no longer needed to hide. As the car pulled away from the gates of the abandoned, perfect house, Eleanor glanced in the rearview mirror. The elegant facade of her old life grew smaller and smaller until it vanished entirely. For the first time since she found the wine receipt, a real, unforced smile curved her lips. It wasn't the sweet smile of the former Eleanor, nor the icy smile of the avenger. It was the calm, powerful smile of a survivor who had won. The engine hummed steadily, carrying her toward a life free of lies, free of Richard, and completely and irrevocably her own.